Part 3. How to Study the Bible. Session 3. Studying Logically. As we said in the previous session, an academic study of Scripture does not ensure a proper interpretation. If studying the Scripture were all about academics, then our best bet would be to find the most intelligent person we know and have him or her interpret it for us. But while it's true that rigorous study does not guarantee right results, it does not mean that hard work and a logical approach to Scripture is insignificant. Not only is it helpful, it is necessary and commanded. Do your best to present yourself to God as one approved, a worker who has no need to be ashamed, rightly handling the word of truth. 2 Timothy 2:15. God calls you to do your best. Laziness is inexcusable. We are studying the very words that God chose to communicate to us. So in addition to studying prayerfully and obediently, we must study diligently. God calls us to love Him with our minds, Matthew 22:37. So it is an act of worship to use our minds to understand His thoughts, which will in turn lead us to love Him even more. We tend to listen carefully when there are consequences for not listening. It's like misunderstanding driving directions and ending up lost and frustrated. How much more important is it to truly understand what God is telling you? As Christians, we claim to base our lives upon the teaching of the Bible, but what if we misunderstand that teaching? The fact of the matter is that we all misunderstand certain passages of Scripture. If we all understood the Bible perfectly, we would all agree on every point of doctrine. Clearly, this is not the case. There are many factors that lead us to misunderstand what the Bible is saying. Our own assumptions, blindly following the views of people who have been influential in our lives, our sinful desire to do our own thing, etc. All of these factors are only intensified when we don't pay close attention to what the Bible is actually saying, rather than what we think it must be saying. It is good for us to keep in mind some general principles for interpreting Scripture. Consider the context. Every text belongs to a context. Every chapter, paragraph, sentence, and word derives meaning from its relationship to the words, sentences, paragraphs, and chapters around it. This is true in reading ordinary books, and it is certainly true in reading the Bible. Consider the word ship. We all know what the word means, and even if we didn't, we could easily find its definition in a dictionary. But ship means different things in different contexts. How you decide whether ship is referring to a large boat or to the process of sending something, you look at the context. This isn't a complicated process, but it is absolutely essential in determining the meaning of the word. We don't usually think about this because reading words in their context is second nature to us. It probably hasn't even occurred to you that you're thinking in terms of context right now as you read these sentences. As you read, you are deciding what these words mean based upon the words around them. When you run into an ambiguous word like the word read in the last two sentences, which could be taken as past or present tense depending on the context, you automatically choose the appropriate definition or tense based upon context. The point of using these simple examples is to highlight an essential aspect of studying the Bible. In order to understand a particular word, verse, chapter, or book, we need to consider it in light of its context. Too often, verses are read and quoted in isolation. While this is not necessarily wrong, it greatly increases the chances of misinterpretation. Here's a helpful way to get the point across. When studying Scripture, think apple rather than orange. Typically, when you eat an apple, you take a bite out of the whole fruit. When you eat an orange, you break it into isolated pieces and then eat the pieces individually. Whenever we read a verse, we should be mindful that we are taking a thought or a bite from a larger story. Always keep in mind that every verse is connected to a chapter, a book, in the entire Bible. One of the best things we can do to understand context is to read the Bible in its entirety. Some choose to do this every year, others on a yearly basis, and others even more frequently. Whatever approach you take to reading the Bible, the more often you read it, the better you will understand the whole story. Question 1. Think about the way you tend to study the Bible. Would you say that you make an effort to seek out what the Bible is actually saying? Do you pay attention to the context? If so, how has this helped you? If not, how do you think this might change the way you read the Bible? Know the difference between interpretation and application. Maybe the most common mistake made in Bible interpretation is when people focus too much on what this verse means to me. It's not uncommon for Bible studies to go around the circle as each person shares an individualized interpretation. Often these interpretations are made with little study and are heavily influenced by opinion and desire. Many times the various interpretations are incompatible with one another. In this type of setting, the focus is not on what God is saying through the Bible. Instead, each person is focused on what he or she thinks the verse means. Whether it's clearly articulated or not, this approach reveals the assumption that the Bible has a personalized meaning for each Christian. It might mean one thing to me, but another thing to you. I don't want to completely disparage this approach. For one thing, many biblical passages have nuances of meaning, and you might notice something that others miss. In that case, going around the circle can be a very helpful exercise. But this is not the same thing as saying that the Bible has a personalized meaning for each one of us. Once we head down that road, there's no longer such a thing as misinterpretation, and people are free to make the Scriptures say anything. It is important to understand that the Bible means what God intends for it to mean. When we ask our children to wash the dishes, we have a clear message we want to get across, and we expect them to figure out what we mean by that statement. In the same way, God has a message to get across, and we all need to work together in order to examine God's words and find out what He is really saying to us. Sometimes when we talk about what this passage means to me, we're actually talking about application rather than interpretation. With interpretation, we're asking what the passage is saying and what it means. With application, we are applying that meaning to our specific situation. Ultimately, each passage has one meaning, but it might have many different applications. For example, in Matthew 22, verse 39, Jesus quoted Leviticus 19:18, which says, "You shall love your neighbor as yourself." The meaning is easy to grasp. We need to love the people whom God has placed around us. But how do we apply that truth to our lives? One person might apply it by helping a neighbor with her yard work, and another person might apply it by listening graciously to a coworker as he shares his concerns about his family. They might choose to apply the same truth to their lives in different ways tomorrow. Application depends on our specific life situations. So we may all read the same passage and walk away with different applications. Interpretation, on the other hand, is all about discovering what God has actually said and what He intended to communicate. We should all read the same passage and walk away with the same meaning. Question 2. In your own words, why is it important to distinguish between interpretation and application?